start calling these like weekly lectures, right? Or teaching lectures, because I've been putting them forth every single week now for the past month, which is good because hopefully it's giving you insight into different ways of teaching and learning that you didn't learn in education when you're studying to become a teacher in college or university. So, this week is all about language acquisition, the development of understanding a language, and how we teach it opposed to how we learn it opposed to how we actually teach it within a school setting. Now, school settings, chances are is maybe middle school or high school when you got your first chance to learn another language, and chances are you didn't have the opportunity to learn it every single semester, so there was no retention of information if you got it again in high school and it been a year or even a couple semesters before your next time. That isn't a system in which is designed to develop a speaker of that language fluent, let alone conversational. And when we look at majority of our indigenous tribes and language loss, and I shouldn't necessarily call it language loss, but that's how we're always framing it, language taken, because indigenous languages were taken within educational spaces amongst, teaching children. And, there's a lot of better videos than what I can actually, unpack in regards to that horrific history. But, go to those other YouTube videos and those other resources to really get a broader perspective of what took place, because I don't want to not do it justice and not describe it as well as it should be described. But language is so important, right? Language is thoughts and understandings of the world around you, and that language is tied to place, the land in which it was originally spoken. And that's why it's so important to retain language, or to relearn it in this case, so that it can be retained and understood, because that's a huge part of sovereignty and understanding, ceremony and everything else, right? Especially in an indigenous context. So a lot of times when we see indigenous language teachers that I have seen, we're teaching it very similar to how we're teaching Spanish or French or Mandarin or all these other languages. Chances are a lot of kids learn how to count to 1,000 opposed to, say, very rudimentary words that they would have learned as a child right off the bat, like makuo, ichuo, like give me, take this, things that you need to survive as a child, and when you look at what is the driving force for majority of our communities, if we're teaching on the reservation, to learn the language is not that it's spoken, not that it's understood, like how we integrate Latin into an educational system where it's like the scientific terminology that we use with an assignment. A lot of times that's what we see in terms of integration, opposed to having it be the language that's actually spoken, because it wants to be, most people want it to be the language of their homes again, right? So if that is the case, how do you design your classroom to support that when it comes to language integration? Now, a lot of times when we start learning a second language, especially an indigenous language, it is absence of the ability to be immersed in the language, because unfortunately there's less and less speakers of majority of indigenous languages in North America, and that's problematic for recreating this immersed environment. But it is extremely important that you integrate language in the context of environment. It should not be absent of that. And that's what we see a lot of the problem is. And one of the hugest problems with me being able to actually process the language and the components that I do know in real time when I'm hearing an elder speak it. So when I still worked at SBC, Sitting Bull College on Standing Rock, we were very fortunate at that time for our immersion nest to be located in the same building as our education department where I taught. And then when I volunteered in the nest, we had several fluent speakers that was their first language. That's a gift, because that is rare, but even with me learning the language from a book to try to teach it, I couldn't integrate that language or process it as fast as I was hearing it, right? So if elders were sitting there talking, the words I knew, but I could not process and understand it in real time. And that's because it's absent of location. Now, if I'm looking at a chair, I don't even have to think of the word in English, because that is my first language, and the word chair pops into my head, right? Like it's almost effortless. Like it takes no thought. It's not like, oh, what was the name of that thing again? Like I have this mental model that I constructed throughout my life of what a chair is. And therefore, when I see it, it's just boom, 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 boom. And this happens all the time in relation to our environment without it really knowing, like we're not really thinking too much because we don't need to. It's almost like autopilot. But that doesn't happen in a second language unless you learn it in context of space. So when you're learning like what these words are and you don't have a mental model of it from your environment. So that way, when you're in that environment, it dings when you see what that object is, constantly reaffirming and strengthening your understanding of it. You have to be absent of everything within your book. And when you're trying to draw on these words, you're not drawing on images, you're drawing on a word, a written word, which we think is very normal, but it was constructed, right? It is, I am losing the word for it, but it's something that we invented in order to, there, I just popped in my head, in order to understand language when it's not spoken, when we don't hear it, but we can transmit information via other means, right? But it's been around for so long that we think like it's very normal. But when it comes to like me learning a second language and only learning in the context of a word, I'm drawing upon these tiny little marks in which helps me then process it, which is much harder for the brain to do opposed to an object or an experience that brings that memory back. So case in point, when I stopped working at the Nest and switched jobs and went back there like 7 months later just to see the students again and say hi to all my fellow colleagues, the language I learned in that space associated with environment and my surroundings when I was at home, those 6-7 months, I kept losing more and more, and I kept being more challenged with remembering it within my environment of my home, even though I was trying to speak it, but I wasn't like immersed in it as much as I was in the Nest. And then eventually, like I really struggled trying to remember these things. And it was an amazing experience that when I went back there, seeing these objects again, like a coat hanger, a jacket on the floor, like all these words and sentences just boom, 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 and became effortless again because I had these contextual clues that I developed within the space where I learned the language. So this is something that I think is important when we look at like mental images help construct language and learning from your senses in regards to spaces, memories in the context of recall. Now, this is important too. This is a great example, and I have it in one of my articles too, that when my daughter and I went camping with my mom's family, my family, I keep doing that, in the cities when we were going up north, and my mom wanted to hear all these beautiful Lakota stories because my daughter went to Lakota immersion school as well. And every single day they sat down on the circular rug with all the Wakaijas, and they would sing these beautiful songs and they would memorize it, and for the life of her in this new environment, in this new space that didn't have any of these mental cues happening, she wasn't able to remember the songs that she literally sung for the last 2 years that she sung in the Nest and on the way home to our house, belting it out in the back seat, but then she ended up going over to the rug in front of the camper, sitting down, replicated how she would have been in the Nest, which is a very beautiful thing to see as a parent and also as an educator, how important like body, space, those cues are, replicating that, even if it was artificial in a different location, for the recall of language or learning. And then all of a sudden, like she started singing all these songs, I could remember them and there was no problem. But she knew, even though I have a doctorate degree in education, like, just what to do in order to recall all that information. And I think that's a great example of the importance of all those cues and recreating them to remember something. We always think like, oh, if we learned it, we remember it, but there's things that can throw us off in actually retaining any of that information, which makes it more challenging to remember long term. So these are important factors, especially designing it in a way that reflects how our community wants the language to be learned. We think of being bilingual as equal, right? And we're saying these words equally within different spaces. But a lot of times, like people learn second languages for business and for different reasons. But then when they're at their home, they struggle communicating in that second language because that is not how they learned it. And this is kind of like how we have designed a lot of our language programs within school spaces. So I think it's important, and I'll just recap again really quick on these components, learning language in context of space. It's okay to learn it from a book and then label something. So then this like whiteboard chamblashka becomes that word and that mental association. So then when I'm in another context, I'm seeing a whiteboard, this pops up into my head and it cues that, right? Because I'm learning it in context of space, and it's important for a while, I think anyways, and this is whatever works best for you, is to label it until you remember it and then pull it off, especially if it's something in your environment that will start cueing every single day when you're doing that. So making sure that we're speaking it, hearing it. There's 4 different components of language, and that is speaking and listening, writing and reading, passive and active. Those are in reverse, like the actual process of doing it, speaking or writing it, but it's important, even if it's a not historically written language, and this is probably problematic because everybody has their own opinions in regards to this, but you have to think about what works better for you, and most second language learners need it written. But if that's all you're doing and you're not creating any of these cues, it's going to be much harder for you to recall the language when you're hearing it from elders. So in regards to being practical, right, and knowing what the goal is, like what is the ultimate goal, that it's the language that's spoken in the household, or whatever the ultimate goal is for you as a language teacher or somebody who wants to support your community's development in some way, shape, or form, giving back what was taken within educational spaces. Have that be in mind, especially if the language was taken. You're not going to teach it the same way as you're teaching Spanish, where you're indicating with like a red line and a -2 or -8 and indicating what they get wrong. There's trauma within the space of loss of language for Indigenous communities. And me as an educator indicating that, I think anyways, is another way we're taking away the language and, like humiliating a child for acknowledging what they don't know, right? Like we need to do like informal assessments that understand what that student needs and understand that we need to keep providing that until they master that component before they move on. Like it's a different process of like, oh, you got this wrong and we're moving on. Sensitivity in regards to how we go about teaching it, so that way we're not shaming a kid for not knowing it. Because a lot of times if we are part of a culture, like as being somebody who's half Mexican, part Mexican, like when you tell anybody that and they're like, oh, do you speak Spanish? And it's like, no. And they're like, oh, you have to speak Spanish, But then like you ask them like, well, what are you? And like, well, I'm like 95% German. I was like, has anybody asked you that you had to speak German? And they're like, no. And it's like, oh yeah, no, duh. But if you're a minority for some reason, like that's usually the reality that we live in. And when you don't know the language of like your grandparents or your parents, there's like shame there, I think. And I've always had that for not knowing Spanish, and I've seen it within my students when somebody who's speaking the language and they kind of hold their head down because they wish that they knew that, right? So I think when we teach it, it has to be taught in a different way that takes away like the threat or the acknowledgement of loss. Okay, so with this gives us a couple of ideas of different ways in which we teach. I keep going back to this idea of context, right? Like absence of context will impact your the true understanding of why something is today. So like if you take if you detach context, it's going to make you harder to understand why these things exist today, and chances are you might support something that is inaccurate. But you need to know what something is in relation to context, history, to understand how you go about teaching, especially when it comes to best practices, especially when it comes to Indigenous populations, because we have a much different, they're sovereign nations. They're not just like a minority group within an inner city space. So this is important to remember as you move forward.